점수 잡는 hackers.
Okay, our second passage. This passage is adapted from Attitudes and Motivations to Use Public or Individual Transport, a case study of two middle-sized cities in social sciences. So the title tells you what? This is going to be specifically a case study of two middle-sized cities regarding their attitudes and motivations to use public transportation or their own cars, right? Now, let's move on to the questions and see what we can learn. Now, we have three big picture questions. The first one asked us about the writer. So the passage is written from the point of view of who? Obviously, the only place we actually have information about the author is the blurb. So you want to utilize that first thing when you deal with these types of questions. The second question, the technique the author uses to advance the point that the distance between public transportation stops and residences is becoming less influential factor in transportation selection. So what do you want to do? The first thing you want to do is, while skimming through the passage, locate where this information is. You should come with a specific line. So the keywords, distance between stops and homes, right? That's what you will remember. Now, the last big picture question, the main purpose of the fifth paragraph, so lines 92 to 101. Mark the paragraph, make sure you understand it, come back to it for this question. Now, what about the detail questions? Well, one detail question, and even better, it's an evidence base. So the details are telling us what? Well, in some part of the passage, it is going to tell us that it is important to acquire and assess data regarding the influence of passengers' impressions on transportation selection. Why is this important? Well, it's important because blah, blah, blah. That's what you're looking for. So your evidence should point to a reason for this question. Let's move on. We have two graph questions. One is simply a graph question, and the other is passage and the information in the graph. Now, do you remember how we dealt with these? Yes. First of all, we start with mainly data question. We start here, we move on to the synthesizing question, but we dissect it just like we do for paired passages. So we're going to start by looking at the answer choices and figure out which part belongs to the graph and which part belongs to the passage. And for this case, this is an evidence-based question. So you will be able to solve this question before actually reading through the whole passage. So let's get started with the graph. Now, for this passage, I think the trickiest part was actually understanding or correctly interpreting what the graph was actually telling us. Now, according to the blurb in the graph, it says, well, the authors of the passage conducted a survey of residents of different parts of the city and its surrounding suburbs regarding the average distance they traveled using each mode of transport. Again, what did they research? This is about the average distance that they traveled, not their preference for any specific type of transportation. Got it? So if you actually take a look at the graph, these graphs denote the distance that people traveled using a certain mode of transportation. So in this case, for the suburbs or out of city, what we see is, well, since the darkest is cars, what we see is what? Well, for distances of about 5,000 meters, people in this area utilized cars instead of public transportation. But let's say for distances under 1,000 meters, what did they utilize? Well, they preferred walking such distances. Understand? So this is what the graph is telling us. The average distance each person or resident traveled depending on the mode of transportation. Got it? Okay, so let's see what 18 asked us. So data in the graph about route distance most strongly support which of the following statements. We're going to compare each answer choice with the graph and figure out which one is correct. So A, in sparsely urbanized areas, residents are most likely to utilize public transportation over other means of transportation. Now again, does the graph tell us whether or not people are most likely to utilize a certain mode of transportation over another? No, it does not. It only tells us what? Well, this is the distance that they traveled using this mode of transportation. So A is something that you cannot get from our graph. Now let's take a look at B. Residents of densely urbanized areas travel by car or motorcycle more frequently than residents of other areas. Again, this is not about frequency. It's about what? It's about the people living in densely urbanized areas utilizing cars and motorcycle for traveling over 8,000 meters of distance. So again, B is something you cannot get from the graph. C, residents of densely urbanized areas are most likely to reserve car or motorcycle transport for long journeys. Yes, this is what our graph is telling us. For long journeys, meaning what? For journeys over 8,000 meters. For these types of journeys, people will prefer to use what? Cars or motorcycles. So for this question, C would be your correct answer. Now let's take a look at D. Residents of sparsely urbanized areas tend to walk longer distances than people in the suburbs do. Now, if you take a look, people in the suburbs actually walk up until what point? Up until 1,000 meters, while sparsely urbanized area residents do not. So D would be incorrect. So again, see how important it is to correctly decipher the information in the graph. If you went wrong and decided that this was about preference, then you would have got this answer incorrectly. Okay, so always look at the labels, the title, as well as the blurb that is provided, and make sure you understand what the graph is telling you. Okay?